Hi there, welcome to the Raising Cinephiles podcast, a show about passing on your love of cinema to the next generation. I'm your host, Jessica Kantor, and I have worked in all facets of the entertainment industry for the last 20 years, and recently became a mom. This week, our guest is Richard Shepard. His career has spanned 30 years of creating film, TV of all shapes and sizes. His newest documentary, Film GEEK, is screening in Los Angeles on September 22nd at the American Cinematheque. It's a personal film about his love of cinema and his relationship with his father. We discuss everything from story structure to sharing his passion for film with his two stepchildren. Always remember that myself and guests are speaking from personal experience, not giving parenting advice. Hi, and welcome back to the Raising Cinephiles podcast. This is your host, Jessica Kantor, and today I am here with Richard Shepard, who is a director, filmmaker. Most recently, documentary Film GEEK is getting ready to screen on September 22nd in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us today, Richard.
I'm happy to be here, Jessica. Thanks.
I'll jump into my first question, which is, what is your first movie memory?
Well, I think I have a first movie memory of, The Wizard of Oz on television, but I'm not sure if that was before or after I went to see King Kong when I was 6 with my dad at a movie theater in New York that served food. I remember that, which was very rare because I was born in 1965. So this was 1972. And movie theaters, there was no Alamo Draft House. There was no food or anything, but this place served food. And I remember having hamburger while watching King Kong with my dad and thinking that life really doesn't get any better than this at all. And I became obsessed with that movie like many kids. And it led me to start even reading books about how they made it. They used to show that movie all the time on TV, so I would watch it over and over again. It got to the point where when I was like 10 or 11, I wrote an article called like King Kong for the 1,000th time. And I wrote this article and I sent it to this film magazine that I used to read, and I sent it to them, and they wrote back saying, we'd be interested in publishing this, but can you just make it shorter? And I did not have the original. I sent the original, so I had no other copy, and I never got it back from them, and it never happened, and who knows whatever happened to that magazine. But I was clearly thinking that my point of view at 10 years old was very important to share with the world about how much King Kong meant to me. And
That was the Dino De Laurentiis.
no,
version.
it was the original.
The
1933 version. So there's the original version, which is what I'm talking about. Then there was the 1976 Dino De Laurentiis remake, which I was very excited to see, but deeply disappointed at 11 years old that it wasn't as good as the first one. And then the Peter Jackson remake, which was really an abysmal movie 10 years ago. I recently rewatched the original King Kong with my stepson. This is a few years ago. And there are things in that movie that are really problematic in the world we live in right now.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can remove that, which is obviously a large but, it's still an incredible adventure film in which you get lost, and the special effects, while being very primitive, absolutely work, and you're emotionally connected to a black and white movie from close to 100 years ago. And that's exciting, and I still love that movie, faults and all.
Yeah. So how old was your stepson when you showed it to him?
He was like 7 or 8 when I showed it to him. He's 16 now, but he was a little kid. And I was like, I saw this at this age. He could handle it. And I think he also knew it was problematic even at 6 or 7 years old, but he also could enjoy it.
Yeah. So my son is only 20 months. So I ask a lot, like, when you think it's appropriate or maturity level for different films, because I'm making a list for his film journey as he gets older.
You're going to find that ultimately kids are who they are. So some kids are very mature and ready to handle things that other kids just can't handle. I showed my stepson 2001 when he was like 10, or 11. And I was like, listen, parts of this are going to be weird and boring, and parts of it are going to be confusing, and I don't have all the answers, and it's okay for a movie not to have all the answers. And he loved it, So I knew he would, there's other kids who I would not, they could, they're 50-year-olds I wouldn't show certain movies to. You do have to get a sense of what kind of kid, who's the person who's willing to see things in a different way. And I
Yeah.
think that's true through your whole life. I mean, you have friends, I'm sure, who you recommend movies to, and other friends you're like, oh, they're not going to like this movie. Well, it's just, I think it's the same thing with introduction of films to kids. It's good to expand their minds if they're inclined to let that happen.
Yeah. So this is a question I ask a lot, and I think it's appropriate at this place in the conversation. Do you think taste is nature or nurture?
Wow. I think it's nurture. I mean, I just made this documentary Film Geek, which is about my childhood and my love of films, but also about my father, who was a loving man, but very mysterious, had several different names, had several different professions, none of them legal. But he was a huge movie buff. So from a very early age, he was sharing his love of movies with me. And there's no doubt that I got it from him. Now, taste is also is we get our level of taste by the exposure of things that we see. I mean, I was lucky to grow up in New York City in the 1970s, which was a weird, dangerous, great time, and movies were definitely alive there. But everything was, art was, theater was, reading was, like, intellectualism was. I was a middle class kid in a rent controlled apartment, but I was able to be exposed to all of this. So I don't know if my taste level is any better than someone who's not been exposed to anything,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't deny that what you're exposed to does influence your creative life.
Yeah. Let's talk about how that journey with your father of some of the films he exposed you to and what that was like for you growing up.
Well, movies were everything to me, and my parents, my mom and dad, we used to go to the movies a lot together. And my dad he was happy to go see, he took me to Hitchcock movies. He took me to see The Godfather at a Revival Theater. But around age 13, 14, 15, I started being able to go to movies by myself, obviously, and my tastes expanded perhaps from great movies to great movies, but I also don't mind a good horror movie or a good stupid comedy. And my dad was like, you can see those movies, but not with me. I'm not going to go with you. And so that was actually a really big shift in which my dad and I stopped going to the movies all the time. And years later, I can actually look back on that and feel a sadness but at the same time, my dad was like, if you want to go see Friday the 13th part 3 in 3D, knock yourself out. And I did. But even one of my favorite movies from growing up is this movie by William Rickard called Winter Kills with Jeff Bridges that actually just Tarantino is re-releasing it right now. It just played in New York. It's about to play in LA. And it is a great weirdo movie. And I went to see that with my dad's senior year of high school. And it was maybe the first movie we'd seen together in a very long time. And I still very much remember that experience. And in my documentary, I talk about it because it was the day that my dad revealed a secret about himself that really explained a huge amount of his personality and his artistic life, because he was also an artist, an unsuccessful artist. And so not only did I find Winter Kills one of the great 70s movies, even though I saw it in 83, but I have this emotional tie to the movie, which I will always have.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Once you went to college, is the explosion of VHS and renting movies.
I worked in a video store in college.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had very eclectic tastes, and I would share my weird tastes with people. The video store rented every type of movie. So it had mainstream movies, art movies, and porno movies. And this was in the mid 80s. This was 85, I think. And it was at the height of the Reagan era Cold War with Russia. And the Russian embassy was renting pornos from our video store. And I remember that the people I work with and we called page 6 of the Post, which is the biggest gossip page in the world. and revealed the names of the porn movies that the Russians rented from our store. It's our patriotic duty as good Americans and also good gossips. But I was able to, obviously, I didn't even have a VHS. I didn't even have a video recorder at that point. I couldn't really afford when I was in college. So they had rental VHSs at the store. So every weekend I would take the VHS home with me along with 9 movies and watch. But it was a perfect job for me. Obviously, I also worked in a movie theater in high school. And at that time in New York, this is 82, 83, there was an unwritten code of ushers, meaning that if you were an usher, you let any usher and their buddy into any movie that you work, any theater you worked in, and they would let you into any movie they worked in. And this was the gift of the gods for me, because I was then able to go see movie after movie, and it was free. I was able to save my money for other things and actually be able to see 4 or 5 movies a weekend.
Yeah, I did that by buying one ticket. That there was a time when you buy one ticket and you have access to all the theaters, and I would just theater jump and stay and watch movies all day. That's my favorite part of going to a film festival, is just being in.
Oh my God, it's the best. Well, if you can
best.
see a bunch of movies and be in some sort of like movie coma for a day or whatever, it's really amazing. And the film festivals especially are so great because you're just getting exposed to movies you probably wouldn't necessarily. There's obviously big releases if you're going to a major film festival, but if you're going to a more regional film festival, you're going to be exposed to movies you'd probably never see and get. It's always like amazing. You're like, oh my God, I just saw this incredible movie by this Palestinian female filmmaker, and oh my God, it was amazing. You're like, well, that may never get released, but at least I got to see it. And I feel like, especially when I grew up before the internet, there was no hype machine. I never heard. I remember there was so little hype and so little. It was just the ads in the New York Times. That's how you knew about movies. And I remember I was a big Spielberg fan. I love Close Encounters. And there was a ad in the newspaper saying there's a preview of a new Spielberg movie 1 week before it opens. It was called Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they had a picture of Harrison Ford or whatever. And I was like, I got to go see it. And I went to the theater, and I had not heard one peep about this movie. I had no idea that it was what it was about. And I remember standing in the theater lobby, and they had these photos from the movie in like just 8 little stills. And each photo looked lamer than the next. I was like, ugh, this movie's going to suck. Like, I was just suddenly like deeply depressed. There was just like a shot of him fighting the bald guy, and it looked bad, and the bald guy looked bad. Like, everything about it looked terrible. And that movie started, and by the time it was over, I don't even believe I walked home. I believe I floated home in a high that I would give anything for. I'm sure I could shoot heroin directly into my brain, and it wouldn't be as good as the high I got from seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark and knowing nothing about it, and coming home and just going on a probably 2-hour monologue to my parents about how they had to go see it. And my dad did go see it and loved it. And it was a very connective thing that I was able now as an adult, or not an adult, a 16-year-old, but whatever, recommend movies to him that he would like. That was a great full circle.
Yeah, I had another guest on who also, parents took him to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he was like, oh, this looks terrible.
Exactly.
You know, and that same experience, all of a sudden he became a cinephile after seeing that movie and just changed his life. So that I've heard that before. And I've also heard from a couple guests that their video store clerk is who helped them understand cinema. Like, they would go in to rent a movie and they would be like, yeah, you want that one, not this one.
Well, there was 2 movies in the early 84 or 85 when I worked at this video store that no one was renting. One was Alan Rudolph's Choose Me, and one was Peter Coyote movie called Heartbreakers. And both of them were indie emotional relationship movies, but done in an incredibly original way, I thought. Bobby Roth's Heartbreakers just really captured what male friendship is like and what a love affair will do to it. One friend meets someone, what it does to a male friendship when they go off with someone. And Choose Me is just a very original a multi-love story. And both movies affected me a lot when I saw them, in college. And so I would recommend them to anyone. And a lot of times people would come back and be like, I hated these movies. I wanted Raiders of the Lost Ark. Why did you make me watch this? But a lot of times people would come back and go, I really was surprised. I love that movie. So I do think that, listen, the video stores attracted people who loved movies if you worked there, because it was like a mecca. If you like ice cream, you should work at a Baskin and Robbins. I mean, it's just it was the perfect place, and that was a nice timing for me that I was able to work there and have that experience.
Yeah, I recently had Maggie McKay on from Vidiots, and there aren't very many places now where a kid can tangibly interact with videos and not be served movies by an algorithm.
It's such a bummer too. Yeah, because even the way, listen, if Amazon or Netflix or Hulu or Max or whatever they're calling it these days, if any of these streaming services had a way to make their interaction feel more like Discovery, where the pictures were bigger, where you could read more about it, where you could see more photos, where it could be a little bit of a discovery, I think it would help them enormously by getting more eyes on more maybe obscure movies, and to them probably cheaper movies to license.
Yeah.
I find it deeply frustrating that all you see is one photo and barely a description. And it's very difficult. I grew up in a time when I could spend hours at a video store just combing through. Maybe this is a weird, this movie was made by this person who I liked. I'm going to see that. Or, oh, wow, that girl in the movie is so sexy. I want to see her in every movie. Like every possible reason you could have. And that is lost. And it's why I think places like Vidiots in LA is having a resurgence, because I do think that younger people are wanting a little more tactile lifestyle. They want to hold a record. They want to pick a video. Yes, there's a kitsch factor and an oddball factor, but it's also great to discover something that most people aren't talking about. I mean, in the world of the internet where everything is talked about, to discover something that isn't talked about by everybody is a really exciting thing. I mean, lately, the Venice Film Festival is happening right now. And if you're on Twitter and following any film Twitterverse, they're talking about, like, this movie got a 7.5 minute standing ovation. This movie only got 5.5 minutes standing ovation. I'm like, this is just awful. This is literally, I mean, I'm happy for the filmmakers I've had a movie at Venice that got a huge standing ovation. Listen, it's a nice thing, but I don't think we should be comparing the 7.5 minute standing ovation that Ferrari got compared to the 6.5 minute standing ovation. You know what I mean? It's a dangerous thing. This information clouds our mind. And so suddenly, this movie didn't quite get the same level of, an audience at a film festival is going to like a movie way differently than a normal person going to a movie. And I don't want to have to be told every single thing. I want to be able to explore.
Yeah. I had this idea because my son has something called a Tony box. I got it for him because I wanted him to have agency. And it basically is these little figures. So there's a llama for Llama Llama pajama books. And he puts it on the box and it tells him the story without a screen, audible story, which gives him some agency. He doesn't always have to come grab me to read him a book, even though anytime he asks me to, I will drop everything and read him a book. And I had this idea that, why not update that interaction, have a little figure that connects to a streamer that you can discover, like an updated video that is a collectible that you put it near on your Apple TV and it will just go straight directly to that film. You don't have to find it and you can watch the movie. And it, like, I don't know if I'll ever figure out how to make something like that, but it's like somewhere in between what we had and where we could be. There's got to be a solution there somewhere.
And there's, listen, I think that the specific world we live in right now, where people are trying to have a little bit more humanity and less algorithm, will lead to some sort of shift in some way. And so we're in a very weird moment right now. Certainly in the movie business, there's strikes happening with the writers and the actors. And by the way, the directors should have been on strike, but they settled too early. But the fact of the matter is, we're at a real reckoning, both in terms of the process of how movies are made, the cost of movies, the cost of trying to make a living as a filmmaker. I mean, I've had a very strange 30-year career. I have managed to still be at it, and it's deeply difficult being a filmmaker for any length of time. And right now, I think a lot of people are dealing with the fact that it's hard to get their movies seen. You can make an interesting small movie, but how does it get seen? If it used to be that it would be on a VHS and you can go into a video store and discover it like many people did, or where people would go to see smaller movies at art houses. Now it's more than a little difficult to find those movies. They might be on iTunes, but if you've never heard of them, finding them is going to be difficult. And the streamers don't really want them because the viewership is less because it's harder to get them to watch and find. And so it's a tough time both for the people who make films as well as the people who love movies who want to figure out a way to get people to discover stuff.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I work between new media and traditional media. I worked a lot in virtual reality. And one of the things that bothered me about making work in that space is there was no audience. And when I worked at Sundance, I learned about the nature of why the festival existed. And it came to be so that the films in the labs could meet an audience, because a film is not complete until an audience engages with that story. And then I think about my son, who I'm like, what will the movie theater experience be for him when he's a teenager? I mean, I lived at the movie theaters. My mom worked. I was in New York City after school and high school, and I didn't know what to do with my time. And I could either go to the Sheep's Meadow and do drugs, or I could go sit in a movie theater or take a ballet class. And it usually oscillated between a ballet class and watching movies at Lincoln Square Cinema. And that's how I developed my love of cinema. And I'm so nervous that the only way my son will be able to see movies is either the New Beverly Vidiots or a museum.
Well, but listen, LA is having a great movie theater resurgence right now. A huge amount of places they're about to reopen the Egyptian, the Vidiots is opened up. There's, Brain Dead Studios, there's the New Beverly. There are a lot of theaters opening, showing cool movies. And that's exciting because they're selling out. The American Cinematheque is selling out. I mean, I'm about to screen Film Geek at the American Cinematheque. I'm so psyched, and I hope people come and see it. It's, it's the perfect place. This is a curated theater that's showing eclectic, interesting movies, and so that's kind of like we're going backwards a little, maybe pre-video store, where we're going to the theater actually is how we discover these things. And so it is a little depressing when big movie theaters are going out of business and closing, and the movie business is constricting in a major way in terms of what the studios are releasing. But listen, good stuff still is getting out there. It's harder, and film festivals are having trouble maintaining, making money. So a lot of them are suffering. The Toronto Film Festival just lost their major sponsor. It's a tricky time. But hopefully people will keep discovering.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I'm just like, the festivals are losing their sponsors, but independent films are gaining sponsors in a strange way. Like, branded content is kind of merging with independent cinema in a smart, interesting way, is helping get the financing across. I'm hearing that from a couple different producers that I've been talking to about, their commercials don't exist the way they did either. So all of these worlds are shifting.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting moment. But if we're talking about learning to love movies, it's also a really great moment. I mean, Criterion Channel streaming is like if you're a film buff at all you need to do is subscribe to that. And there's a movie a day that is really good, and even some that aren't, in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah. And Canopy from the library.
Is free. And we're in this, if you want it. Now, obviously everyone is different. I grew up in my documentary Film Geek is about my obsession during a very specific period of from the first movie I remember seeing King Kong until the end of high school. So just that period of time and my relationship with my father during that period of time. And I grew up in a time where New York was every place you went, there was a movie theater screening. Well, New York's got a little of that energy now. You know,
Mm.
the Metrograph, the reopened quad, there's film at Lincoln Center. There is a sense of movie theaters in a way that hasn't been for a long time. So, yes, some bigger theaters may have closed, but if you're interested in stuff, it's there,
Mhm.
if you're willing to, see it.
And so, will you speak a little bit to getting your film at Cinematheque, and what you're hoping to get out of that?
I made this documentary basically during COVID. It was I edited it with a college buddy of mine named Adam Lichtenstein, who is also a film nut. And I tell this story of my childhood through the reuse of film clips of the movies I saw. So we repurpose these movies that I'm not only talking about, but then we use clips of them to tell my story. And it was super fun to do. We used over 200 movies as I talk about over 200 movies, and we used those clips. And Adam and I shared a similar language on if I was like, hey, I'm telling this story about my dad showing up with a bag full of money. Is there a movie from the 70s or 80s that we saw in which someone's walking with a bag of money? And he's, yeah, and Thief, James Caan's walking with a bag. I'm like, great,
I love that.
let's use that clip. And so the movie's like that. But Adam and I edited it over the internet. He was in his house, I was in my house. We FaceTimed, and then I saw his Avid on my computer screen, and that's how we edited the movie. And I made this simply for me. I made it. I didn't think, or nor do I think this is going to be the box office bonanza of all time. I made a documentary about my childhood. I never had talked about it really, and I wanted to. And I'm not a famous filmmaker, so it's not like Paul Thomas Anderson's making a movie about his childhood and everyone wants to see it. But I made this film for me. And then I just started sharing it with people who I knew loved movies. And my friend Larry Karaszewski, who wrote Ed Wood and The People vs. Larry Flint, saw it. And he was like, hey, I think I'd love to present this at the American Cinematheque. I'll do a Q&A and we can show it to people. And I was like, that's a dream. Let's start showing it to people. But it wasn't, I don't believe if I'm making a movie that ultimately cost very little money to make and made it for myself, that was the journey, was the destination. I'm deeply proud of it. But if I can start sharing it, that's great. I've made bigger movies. I've directed television. I've made independent films of all budgets. Some you feel like, hey, this is going to reach a mass audience, or you hope it will.
Mm-hmm.
And some, you just kind of do something, to be
Yeah.
creative, to go on a journey. I became a better filmmaker from making the documentary, there's no doubt, and a better writer because I had to tap some personal stuff and tell it in a way that would be interesting to people who didn't love movies necessarily like I didn't grow up in Manhattan, when I didn't have a interesting complex relationship with their father like I did. So how do I tell that story in a way that can be connective to people? And that was challenging, and I'm excited that people are going to get to see it, and hopefully we'll start screening it in other places.
Yeah, I definitely want to get tickets to go see it. It's
They're selling out, Jessica. So get on
okay. I'm getting on top of it.
AmericanCinematheque.com or whatever.
Okay.
And Friday the 22nd in LA.
Yeah, it's my mom's birthday that day, but she's out of town and we're celebrating the next day.
Perfect.
Yes.
Get a babysitter and come on
Exactly.
down.
Yeah. Okay. So I asked this question a lot. You were in love with movies, but when did you know you could work in the industry? Like, when did that click for you?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think I read this book about Spielberg and Coppola and Lucas and De Palma called The Film Brats. And I was reading that in high school, and it talked about how all of these guys went to college, went to film school, and then how they ended up transitioning into becoming professional filmmakers. And I was like, wow, I want to be a director. First, I wanted to be the third baseman for the New York Mets. But at about age 10, I realized that I wasn't quite up for that. But as soon as I understood what directing was, I wanted to do that. And I was making Super 8 movies like a lot of kids. And I was so naive to how difficult having a career in the film business was, as I believe you should be at that age. I just believed that I could make this happen if I went to one of those film schools. And again, plenty of people don't go to film school and have huge careers or drop out, like going to film school. But at that moment in my life, especially because I was not a very good student, it became a motivator for me. I better do well enough to get into NYU so I can go to NYU, so I have a chance of doing this. Now, I think if I had not gotten into NYU, I probably would have still figured a way to make movies. But you know, there is no roadmap. I've spent my entire career basically on a job interview. I've never had like a solid job. I've had 3 months here, 6 months here, 2 weeks here. And I'm constant for 30 years, and I've had to reinvent myself. I've had to figure different ways of doing it. There's no book, and no one can ever tell you how to have a career in the film business. There's a million different ways to do it. And some people want to make big studio Marvel movies, and some people want to make small little movies and are going to be struggling their whole career just to get grant money to make them. So there's a million different ways to go about a career. I've been able to make bigger movies, smaller movies. I direct a lot of TV pilots. I direct a lot of television episodes. I've made documentaries. I've made short films. I constantly want to be creating. And usually when I do create something, it leads to something else. If I'm doing something very small for myself, usually that will, like I did a short film a few years ago that I asked Elizabeth Moss, who I didn't know, and I asked Eben Moss-Bachrach, who's now on The Bear, who I knew from Girls, where I directed a lot of episodes. And I asked them to go for 5 days to Tokyo and do a short in which I wasn't going to pay them. And I basically my experiment was, can I make a beautiful love story in Tokyo in 5 days with a crew of under 20 people and one light, and make it look beautiful, and for me be able to do something in which I wasn't having to get normal coverage of, I wasn't having to follow any rules. And I had gotten a residual check from Girls, and it was a nice, back when you could get a residual check, and I was like, I'm going to just turn this check around and I'm going to go make this movie. So we flew to Tokyo. I flew coach to Tokyo. You know, no one was being paid. It was 5 incredible days. And then I made this movie that was life-changing. First of all, I sold it to HBO and made my money back plus profits and continue to make profits from it. So from a purely like financial thing, it was a win. But I got to work with Elizabeth Moss, who then asked me to direct some episodes of Handmaid's Tale. It deepened my relationship with Eben Moss-Bachrach as a friend and as a cohort. And I work with some really great people who I still work with, the DP and all of that. So it's amazing how something that can be very small can lead to something very big, but you have to be malleable. I mean, I was lucky I had the money to be able to do it. Not everyone does, but I'd also been working long enough to hopefully have made some money.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly why I decided to do this podcast. Was I was coming out of the postpartum and pandemic haze and felt like I was just taking jobs for the paycheck. And I was like, I want to remember my passion for cinema and have a reason to talk to people I admire. And here we are.
Yeah, we are.
Here we are. And it is leading to interesting things and new projects and new relationships. And I've always believed work begets work, especially when you're creating something honest.
100%. And especially in a business like ours, like you're never more valuable than when you're working, and you're never more valuable when you're working on something in which you don't need the big people to do it. Honestly, every time I've made a documentary or I've done something small, and people are asking, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I'm doing this. Suddenly they're like, what? you're doing something without us? Come do something with us. I mean, it's just the weirdest psychological thing. And,
Yeah.
I come from independent movies. I've made movies for features for $50,000. I've made movies for $20 million. I've made both things. And I just refuse to be, I'll continue to try to pivot as long as I can,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the only way. And it's a great business if you can figure out how to navigate it. And listen, I always tell this story. I was lucky enough to win an Emmy Award for directing the pilot of Ugly Betty.
Hmm.
And I had two speeches, and I deeply regret the speech I gave, which is a perfectly normal thank you and thank the blah,
Hmm.
blah, blah. But I just chickened out at the last minute. But what I wanted to say was that I found it very amazing to win an award for directing television when 2 years ago, meaning 2 years before I won this award, I had my cable shut off because I couldn't afford to pay the Time Warner bill.
Hmm.
And that was true. It was so that is that's a valley, and then
Yeah.
there's a hill, but that's within 2 years of each other. So
Yeah.
it's pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
I told this story, I think, once already on the podcast, but my first year working for Sundance was like 10 years ago, I think. And I was on the plane home from the festival. And it's like everyone from the festival is all on the same flights together. And I ended up sitting next to the woman, the producer who won the festival that year. And she was telling me what the week she was going to have because she had to produce 2 huge commercials. And I was like, what do you mean you're producing commercials? I thought you were a film producer. I didn't she goes, well, this doesn't pay the bills.
Yeah.
Like the commercials pay the bills. And it just blew my mind that, here she won one of the most prestigious independent accolades. And yet she had to go back to her, quote unquote day job.
Yeah. There's not a lot of money in independent film.
No.
You're not going to get rich just doing independent film.
Yeah. But it's an amazing, well, one, the art for the art's sake is amazing, but also showing that you can make something is the most important thing.
And making something. I mean,
Yeah.
The journey is the destination.
Yeah. Okay. So in the time we have left, I want to talk about your relationship with your children. And you have stepchildren, or do you have?
I have 2 stepchildren.
Okay. My relationship with my stepfather was really meaningful to me. So I'm very happy that I finally have a step parent on the show, because I think for us, I know every step parent to child relationship is unique to that story. And for me, my stepfather came into my life when I was 12, 13 years old and was having issues with my biological father. And he didn't take on the role of parent and just let the relationship evolve over time. And we found our thing. And I will never forget, about a year before he passed away, I came into his house with my mom, and he came out and goes, wait, stay right here. He ran into his office and he picked out a Post-it note of movies and television that he read about in the Financial Times he wanted to watch with me. And I was just like,
amazing.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about that relationship with your children.
Well, I have 2 great stepkids, and they have a great dad who is a lovely guy. And we have a very nice blended family. And it's actually, kudos to my wife, Jenny, and her ex-husband, Ben, for figuring out how not to hate each other after divorce. And Ben also had a stepdad that was meaningful to him. So he understood that, having his kids have more love in their life is a good thing, not a bad thing. And listen, I have this joke that through my kids as they were younger, whenever they wanted to go see a new movie, if I wanted to see it with them, I would see it with them. And if I didn't, I'd be like, yo, you should see that with your dad. I mean, both kids have a definite interest in movies. I built a little screening room in my garage, and I only allow movies to be screened in it, not TV. And it's a 2-couch screening room, but it's a movie room. And I think they understood that. I mean, they snuck some TV in when I wasn't around, but in general, they understood that this room was for watching movies. And, I have so many memories of introducing these kids to movies that I loved. Before I made my short in Tokyo with Lizzie Moss, I had gone there for an episode of Girls that shot in Tokyo that I didn't direct, but I went because my wife, Jenny, was the producer of the show and the showrunner of the show. And our kids met us after the shoot, and we went around for a few weeks. And when we came back, we had unbelievable jet lag the first night. And my stepdaughter was like 13, I think, at the time, 12 or 13. And just huge jet lag. And we were both up at 4 a.m. And I'm like, you know what? Let's go watch Lost in Translation. And we went into the screening room, weirdly wide awake. And I showed her this movie, and the experience of showing that beautiful movie to her and having her say, I've never seen a movie like that. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't plot heavy, because it was just beautiful and artful and about humanity and about being in Tokyo and not sleeping. So it was very relatable. But from an emotional standpoint, she hadn't seen a movie quite like that. And so those memories like stick out in major ways. I mean, obviously, it's not all about movies with kids at all. And my kids, I don't think either of them necessarily want to be in the film business, nor am I encouraging them to. If that's what they want to do, they can. But, they have deeply varied interests. My stepdaughter's in college now. My stepson's a junior in high school. And, it's my life became better when kids came into my life, because as an only child, I spent an enormous amount of my life only thinking about myself. And the thing, and I don't mind thinking about myself. I like myself. But when you have kids, it changes everything. It's about someone else. And that understanding, that realization to me, even if it came later in life for me, it really was amazing and has definitely influenced my creative life. And kids are not for everyone. Stepkids are not for everyone. People are who they are. It was kind of perfect for me, to be quite honest, having stepchildren, because we had them half the week. So for Jenny, it was difficult that she didn't have her kids for half the week. But for me, it was great, because for half the week, we were a couple without kids, which was like, oh, well, we can go out to dinner. We can stay up late. We can get drunk. We can do whatever we want to do because we don't have kids. So it's been pretty amazing. The whole, it was pretty great. And now as I get older, my kids are recommending movies to me, and I just see exactly like with my dad, how I started recommending movies to him at a certain age, and they're growing in confidence to be able to do that. And, they're good movies. Both kids have really good taste in movies,
Yeah,
I'm very happy about that. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. The thing I'm most excited about, which is partly why I started this podcast, was to get to watch and read and experience everything over these years.
Well, watching a movie that you love with a kid is such a great experience, because first of all, you really get to rewatch it in a different sort of way, because you are seeing it through their eyes. It's like when you make a movie and you screen it for people, it's a living, breathing thing. Movies are not like theater in that they are permanent. But I actually think every time you screen a movie for an audience, it's a live thing. So sometimes the movie plays with it's too fast, and sometimes the movie's too slow, and sometimes the movie works and sometimes it doesn't. And it is an audience reaction. And it's never more heightened than when you're watching a movie you love with your kid. And you'll see this when they get older, because you're going to be like, oh, they're not liking that moment. Or, man, they love that moment. I loved it too. So that you get this thing where you're going through, it's different than just rewatching a movie you love by yourself.
Yeah.
That's one experience. Rewatching it with a kid, especially when you're, in quotes, showing it to them or sharing it with them. That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I had John Wyatt founded Cinespia in Hollywood, and he was like, I'm so jealous that you get to be the film curator for your child's life. You get to decide what goes on the screen for a period of time until I let him loose and he shows me what he likes. But yeah, I'm super excited about that. So I'm going to ask you my final question, which I ask every guest, which is, it doesn't matter. It can be at any age. So at any point in the future, what is the film or films I should show my son so he falls in love with cinema?
Well, I've thought about this question because you told me in the email that you were going to ask it. And I guess I'm going to circle back to the movie that I saw when I was 14 that made me want to be a filmmaker and made me really understand what a director does, and also blew my mind. I went with my dad to see Apocalypse Now, and it's not a movie you can show someone who's 8 or 9 years old. They have to be a little older, but you've got time, you know. And it's a movie in which all elements of what filmmaking can be: picture, sound, music, story, acting, editing, sound editing, all of it is on display. And it's about the height, it's at the top of the mountain of film making.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, at least, not it's not everyone's cup of tea, but for me, and I got to show Mac, my stepson, at 14, right when the same age I saw it, I showed it to him. And he found it very interesting, and he was able to really get into it and get into the sound and get into the story and how cool it looked and all the practical effects and the human story and how weird it is. And so it's not necessarily a movie that would be, hey, this movie is going to get your kids to love movies, but it is a movie when your son is old enough to say, hey, listen, it's not only how amazing these movies are, but they are also art. They
Mm-hmm.
are also art. And so in the right hands, in the right moment, a movie can not only be a piece of entertainment, but as moving as anything in the world. And I saw Apocalypse Now, and I immediately saw it again. And I bought the soundtrack album, which at the time was like a double album.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just the narration of the movie and the music. And I just spent all summer like listening to the album, over and over again. I read Eleanor Coppola's book about the making of the movie. It's extraordinary what my devotion to that film.
Yeah.
And it was also amazing because I made a documentary a few years ago on the actor John Cazale, who played
Mm-hmm.
Fredo in The Godfather. It was called I Knew It Was You, Rediscovering John Cazale. I made it for HBO. And I got to interview Coppola because Coppola directed 3 of the 5 movies that Cazale did, the 2 Godfathers in The Conversation. And Cazale died at 42. And he only made 5 movies, all of them nominated for Best Picture. But I got to sit and talk to Coppola at Zoetrope in San Francisco.
Cool.
And all I wanted to do was like, just say, hey, I know we're doing this, but you need to know about my unbelievably obsession with Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
And probably the reason I'm sitting here even talking to you is because of that movie that made me believe that understand what a director did and how unbelievably fun that must be to sit there and be able to create that world.
Yeah. I wrote a paper about Apocalypse Now at NYU, diving in. It was a cinema studies class, and I compared Apocalypse Now and Forrest Gump's depiction of the Vietnam War.
Oh, interesting.
My teacher did not like the paper, but I still am very proud of it because they're, I both think are very interesting films in very different ways. But there was something similar in how they depicted the war.
Well, one film is still watched and talked about, and one film is talked about and not watched.
Yeah.
I think Forrest Gump, people know it was a good movie. They liked it. It's on Netflix. I'm sure people watch it, but it is not a zeitgeisty movie. Apocalypse Now, and again, it was a very operatic view of the war. It wasn't a down on the ground, boots on the ground platoon or 1917 or any war movie in which you're on the ground with them. It is a operatic view of it. But in the story, the war is treated as an opera. The movie is an opera in a way, and it is still connective, I think, because it barely gets any better in terms of the way you can tell a story on film, I think.
Yeah. And there's one song, and I'm not musical, so I can't hum it for you, that is from the 70s, and I remember it with the chopper coming down, and it's used over and over again, and I hear that song and I'm like, oh, we're at the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Immediately I know that, it's of an era, it's of that moment. And yeah, so when you talk about the soundtrack, it's pretty insanely powerful.
Well, one of the, just on a segue from, I know we're finishing up, but I didn't want to read anything when I was a kid. I didn't mind when I was a little kid being read to, but then when I was old and I was supposed to read, I just didn't want to read. But then I started getting into movies and I wanted to read more about them in a way. And now I'm a really big reader, but it happened because I found something I was interested in and it led into stuff. So reading Eleanor Coppola's book about the making of Apocalypse Now was like, oh my God. First of all, what an incredible story and what she went through, but also her diaries are so honest about her relationship with her husband and when they separate and how they get back together and all of this stuff. And it was like, I was 13, 14, however old I was. And whoa, that was a lot to take in, a lot.
I wonder if there's an appetite for that as a film after The Offer.
Meaning appetite for what?
That sort of fictionalized but dramatized truth of the making of a film that changed.
You mean, would they do a movie about the making of Apocalypse Now because it was so crazy?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, The Offer, I don't know if it was super successful, because they don't reveal their numbers. But I would be interested in seeing it.
Yeah.
But I would also probably be annoyed by it because knowing the real story, I don't necessarily need to see the fictionalized story unless it's fictionalized in an operatic way that becomes its own piece of art.
Yeah.
The Offer was interesting, and just in that, it was interesting to see how they told that story. And obviously stuff was compressed and not, it was what it was. I enjoyed it, but it was also like, well, that's not really the story. So what am I doing here? But I still watched it because I like the actors and everything. But if we can make art about telling art, then great. It's like we have a lot of true crime stuff. And at a certain point, if you can make art about telling this, great. If not, then I'd just rather watch a documentary. I'd just much rather watch a documentary.
There was a comedy about a true crime show on Peacock or something that I watched that I actually really enjoyed because it was poking fun at this whole obsession, and I found it really entertaining. But with The Offer, I thought was interesting is I didn't want to watch it. I watched a little bit of the beginning and shut it off, and I was like, I don't need to watch the sausage being made,
right?
Again. And my mom was actually obsessed with it and loved it and was like, I want you to watch it so I can talk to you about it. So please watch it. And then after a few episodes, I got into the way they told the story.
Wow, yeah.
And I got into it. So that was one where I watched it for my mom and then enjoyed it afterwards.
I think a lot of these miniseries, it's tough getting the first or second episode, and then you can get into it. For me, it's like, can I get through the first one to even get into the second or third one?
Yeah. I saw there was this deck going around a year or two ago from Netflix about how they want to see structure of a season, which was basically an extended film. So the first 3 or 4 episodes was the first act. And I was like, oh, so you're really asking people to give you 3 episodes before they commit to this story. Right. And I think it speaks a lot to what you just said of this idea of a movie arc or 3-act structure in a season arc, which it's interesting, but I'm not sure I fully agree with.
Well, they're just different animals. I mean, a limited series has the ability to really dive into story in a way that a movie can't. And I think there's pluses and minuses for both a limited series and a series. I mean, Handmaid's Tale is deeply complex. That show, there was a movie made of that book and it was perfectly okay. And the show is so much deeper and able to go so much deeper. And they do it in a way that is continually surprising and emotionally valid. Certain stories should be told as a movie. I mean, I think that I love to go into a theater, have a beginning, middle, and end. And not necessarily even a beginning, middle, and end. You can have an end, middle, and beginning. I don't care. As long as I'm in for 2 hours or whatever it is, and I've been told a story, I love then leaving and having been told that story. And I'm done. Now I can talk about it and think about it. And I also love when a series or limited series can keep it going and keep me getting deeper and deeper into it. So I think there's two distinct things. I think it gets a little more dangerous when you're trying every episode to tell a full story in an episode, because then you're like short shrifting what television can do, which is really elongate the moments that are interesting and deep dive into the characters that are interesting. And that stuff's, I think that's amazing.
Yeah, that's why I love this trend now of books to television. I think that translation is so much better for the most part than books to movies, because you can go really deep into different character in a way that sometimes when I love a novel, I feel like it doesn't do it justice necessarily.
Well, they always said that if you're going to make something into a movie, it should be a short story that you expand as opposed to a novel that, now, obviously, we're talking about Coppola, he figured out a way to tell The Godfather in a way that is quite memorable. There's definitely movie versions of book. Lolita by Kubrick is an incredible movie version of a book. But I agree with you that a lot of the time in trying to condense the story, they lose what makes the book itself so compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for those examples, they use the book as reference material, not as a template. Like they refine the story in a new format.
Correct. I agree with that.
Well, I can talk to you about movies and TV and book and structure for hours and hours, but we're up at the hour, and I definitely want to respect your time, Richard. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Super fun, Jessica. Thank you. It was really fun.
If you enjoyed the conversation, please don't forget to like and subscribe. New episodes release every Wednesday. And leave a comment and let me know which movie you think I should show my son. Until next time, take care.